all the way at the beginning here. How do I start at the beginning?
Go on the left bar there. Go all the way to the top.
Okay, there we go.
Arrow up.
There we go. I have to go all the way through this thing. All right. Here's a little comedy to start. There we go. All right. There we go. Play. Excellent. All right, guys. Thank you so much. All right. Alrighty, guys. Yeah, this is a wonderful facility, and thank you so much for having me here. So just want to start that the sea is rising. And so we've already talked about this a little bit. I work all around the United States, especially from the Outer Banks of North Carolina all the way into the Keys. And the common story is that, yes, the sea is rising. So this is down here at Key West. It's a tide gauge that goes all the way back to 1913. And we see about 9 inches of rise over about 100 years down there. And this is also in the Keys, and it's about 13.5 inches right here, Marathon Key. Fort Myers here locally, about 1 foot over 100 years. We've already talked about that. And it's not just in Florida. So you go up to Charleston, it's about 1 foot over 100 years. You go up to Georgia, about 1 foot over 100 years. All right, so you can see this, all right? We see this. And so why does the sea rise? All right, so just a little basic science lesson. One is that warmer water expands in volume. And of the sea level rise we've seen over the past 100 years or so, probably about 50–60% just has to do with the heating of the water. Right, so this is just basic physics, okay? Then also ice melt. And so what we've seen ice melt, things like mountain glaciers, the ice sheets, maybe about 30% of the sea level rise that we've seen over the past 100 years has to do with ice sheet melt. We expect that to really increase. And some minor things like groundwater that we pull out and that goes out in the oceans, that also causes the sea to rise a little bit. And that ends up being pretty minor, but we still try to account for that. And what's interesting is that the sea is not level is one of the jokes we say in sea level rise science. And we'll see things like this, right? So Louisiana, very famously, the sea is rising a lot faster than certain areas, or it seems like it. And why is that? Does anyone know what's happening around areas like New Orleans and Louisiana? Yeah, subsidence, right? So various things that we do. It happens here with oil and gas extraction. That's actually causing the ground to sink really fast. In certain areas of the world, things like groundwater extraction can cause the land to sink. Yeah, so basically subsidence. And what's interesting, there are areas of the world, you can actually see some tide gauges that look like this. And oftentimes I'm talking to crowds like, well, the sea's rising somewhere, it's also falling in others. Why would this happen? Does anyone know why? Yeah, so the land's actually uplifting in these areas. And this actually has to do with glaciers that actually melted a long time ago, very, very heavy, and the land is actually rebounding up. So that's what happens there, okay? And then also the sea isn't level. There's certain areas of the world where the sea's rising a lot faster than others. So for example, at the Pacific, certain areas it's rising very, very fast. Other areas not quite as fast. What's interesting about Florida, we're right about the global average. And really, as a matter of fact, Key West, we oftentimes use that as one of the baselines for thinking about what's happening kind of globally. Here we're very stable. There's not much subsidence. There's not a lot of uplift. Okay, and then so if we just think about what we've seen over the past 100 years, if we just draw the straight line, we'd expect to see maybe another foot over the next 100 years, but there's different kinds of projections with sea level rise. And so all the way from minimum of 8 inches all the way up to 6.5 feet, even sometimes now people say 10 feet over the next 100 years. And I oftentimes get this. Who cares about 2100? Right? So this is one of the first things that you hear. I always use this. This is my son hanging out with my grandmother, and she's 88. And my son will be 88 in the year 2100. And so when I think about why do we care, it really is, yeah, because human values, right? We want the future to have what we have, right? We don't just think, oh, I'm gonna die, so who cares about 2100? No, we do care, I think. And then I oftentimes get asked this, right? So we give these projections about sea level rise. It can be overwhelming. I get asked all the time. I wish I had 5 cents for every time I was asked this. Which scenario is going to happen? Is it going to be 1 foot? Is it going to be 7 feet? And I get angry people saying, tell me a number. You know? And then of course, what I can always say is, being a nerd, is that we don't exactly know. And so I'm going to show you on some tide gauges, and we can use data to try to figure out where we're going. And I'm going to show you some data here. So I thought I was going to show you some data there. What happened? So we'll come back to that here in a minute. But what we know now is that really the signal-to-noise ratio that we have for what we see in the tide gauges isn't enough to say what's going to happen in 2100. The way that we kind of think about this, and it makes people nervous a lot of times, it really has to do with carbon emissions. And so really with the amount of carbon emissions we have, if we don't care about climate change and we're not going to reduce carbon emissions, much higher chance we're going to have a lot of sea level rise. If we get serious about carbon emissions, we have a much higher chance of it being lower. And so climate change, I wanted to put this in here. Of course, coming down to Southwest Florida, I actually lived in Sarasota for 5 years, went to college there. And it's not just sea level rise, but things like toxic algae that have to do with nutrients, but they also like warm water. And so, for example, within Lake Okeechobee, there's a lot of nutrients in Lake Okeechobee. And there's enough nutrients to feed algae for the next 100 years or more, even if we clean up the water. But what causes the algae blooms, you can have a few days of it being just no clouds, and it being really warm will actually cause algae blooms to happen within Lake Okeechobee. And so really toxic algae and climate change unfortunately go hand in hand. And the red tide as well, and I just had to put this in here as well because I know red tide, I'm sure that you guys are still traumatized of the red tide that was happening. And a red tide, unfortunately, seems to like warmer water as well. The other thing, and there's been some scientific argument about this, but I come out very, very much on the side that nutrients do make it worse. And so we hear a lot about a red tide being a natural phenomenon, which is true. And all of the nasty algae, in fact, are in fact natural. But not in the sense of how we've been seeing them. And then with red tide in particular, there is really enough science to say that it likes nitrogen in particular. If you feed it with nitrogen, you get more red tide. And so that means more nitrogen that we have, we're going to have more red tide. Why am I just going to go on a limb and say that? And so this is what I was saying before, is that really when thinking about sea level rise and which trajectory are we going to go on, that the science tells us that the more carbon emissions we have, the higher chance of having a lot of sea level rise. Exactly how much we still don't know. There are scientists arguing about that. And so if anyone tells you it's going to be this, you know that they're probably going out on a limb. And so, again, we don't know exactly. As I've worked all around, again, so I'm just going to show some pictures here. Tybee Island is where I first got started working on sea level rise. And then I went to St. Mary's. I always wanted to come back to Florida. I'm from Florida, so I just worked my way back down. I worked up in Hyde County, North Carolina, a very agricultural community, and probably the worst issues with sea level rise I've ever seen, where you have fields that are just lined with salt. And then also in the Keys. I'm going to talk a lot about the Keys. And as well, I've worked on the East Coast as well a little bit as well, at Satellite Beach. I'm going to talk a lot about Satellite Beach. And here's just a map of communities I've worked in. And so basically local governments are right at the front line. And this is the institutional context of sea level rise, is that we don't really have a national policy on sea level rise and not even really a state policy. We're kind of getting there, but really local governments are having to figure this out, each one on their own pretty much. Like, what are we going to do about this? And why is that? Because when there's a flooding issue that happens with stormwater, it's almost always going to be the local government that's the one that's responsible for that, and they're the ones that have to respond. And so oftentimes, again, when I get asked how much sea level rise, what should we plan for, I say, asking for a direct number is not the right question. It's really, what are you building, and what is your risk tolerance? If you have something like a garden shed, if you're building right in your yard, Planning for 7 feet of sea level rise by 2100 for your garden shed probably isn't the best idea. I imagine having a ladder or a big ramp, you're trying to get your lawnmower out, okay, that's not a good idea. A nuclear power plant, though, even small probability events of risk. I know people, I know engineers in particular that say, sea level rise, it's really exaggerated. I'm like, are you so confident in that you're just going to build the nuclear power plant without thinking about sea level? Well, no, we wouldn't do that because of course, nuclear power plants, very low tolerance for risk, and we have long horizons of time we're thinking about. So it's really your asset. Okay, but where we're at right now with sea level rise and with planning and really getting in the weeds of this, the first thing that happens with sea level rise with local governments is the first things that start to go are the things that are underground. So things like stormwater pipes and wastewater pipes start to have impacts. And this is even before you see the water coming up on streets. And so you might have seen some of the famous, for example, in Miami, where they have king tide events, and there's water in the streets, and there was an octopus that was in like a parking garage, and so that's really, once that happens, I always say that's the freak out factor, and I always they ask, why does Tybee Island in Georgia, why are they planning for sea level rise? US 80 that takes you from Savannah out to Tybee, about 20 times a year now, will just no storm or anything, just a really high tide, a king tide will flood that road to where you can't drive on and off of it. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, whatever, you don't like that. All right, so people, they want to fix that, okay? And so, for example, Tybee Island, and this is a little bit dated now, but I drove all the way from Athens, Georgia, which is like 6 hours, with a graduate student at the time, so we're going down to this corner, and I didn't even tell them why, but we're going to go down there. And so we drive down there, and there was water coming out. Can anyone see what's happening up there? That is a storm drain, right? It's a storm drain, and the water is coming out the wrong way, okay? And what was happening is that it was built in a low-lying area. Back in the 30s, someone had the great idea, we're going to heap the marsh over this way, we're going to create new land, and as it turns out, you get 80 years later, it doesn't really drain very well, it's kind of sunk a bit, and then you get these issues, right? Stormwater, tide water coming in and flooding. All right, so we see some of this down in here. You can get this house for real cheap over here, by the way. And what's happening, and so before the Clean Water Act, and we have a lot of this around the country, around the state of Florida, we used to build stormwater pipes, we'd put it out. The engineers back in the 40s and 50s weren't dumb, but what they would do is they said, okay, this is going to be the high tide level, so, the water's going to go in, and great, it's just going to go out. Not so great for water quality, but that's something else. But over time, with sea level rise, you start getting this happening, right? So you get the tide water coming in, you start to get things like barnacles growing in here. This doesn't drain as well. And oftentimes, the only people that know about this are going to be your public works officials. And like, we really should clean out the stormwater drains. And then you'll get, it rains real heavy, and then it starts to flood a little bit more. And people, why is it not draining so much? Well, because you got barnacles, and you got water in here. When people freak out is when this happens, all right? It's not raining, and now there's octopuses that are now inside the parking garages because of this happening, okay? And so that's typically when communities start to plan for sea level rise, or at least over the past 10 to 15 years is when it's so obvious because this shouldn't be happening. So this is what they did on Tybee. There's like little simple fixes. You were talking about the 30-year fixes. This is what this is. We went in, we did a big evaluation for them and said, upgrade your stormwater facilities. You can put these little flap gates here. When the tide gets real high, it'll keep the water out. And they were happy to have this with Irma and Matthew. It actually did help with flooding. But probably 30, 35 years is what this is going to buy them in terms of time. And so just to plug that stormwater mapping, and I'm like a stormwater mapping, what's the word I'm looking for? Preacher. That local governments in particular, it's like a detective story when I go out. The first thing I do when I'm working on sea level rise is, have you mapped your stormwater? Some places have done it really well. A lot of small communities don't know where their stormwater is. And so going out there and really mapping it is very, very important. There's my son helping me in the Keys. I'm training him young. And then the other, and so oftentimes I'll hear with flooding issues, and I'll talk in areas like Orlando. Well, we don't have to worry about sea level rise here. We're high and dry. Well, the National Flood Insurance Program, so if you have flood insurance, we're all basically contributing to that, even if you have flood insurance or not. And what's interesting about the flood insurance maps is that right now they don't take into account of anything with climate change. They just don't. They also don't take into account anything with local stormwater infrastructure. And so with flood maps that are actually produced, they just create these general maps. And so oftentimes, well, I'm not in a flood zone, so I'm not going to flood. Even if you have water in the street in front of you, you should probably get flood insurance. I'm just going to recommend that for you. I'm going to skip over the community rating system here a bit. Except to say that basically the community rating system, this is just an incentive structure through the federal flood insurance program that they're trying to get local governments to plan for climate change through some incentives. All right, let's go up to St. Mary's, Georgia. Has anyone been to St. Mary's, Cumberland Island? Yeah, beautiful little city. Worked on this resiliency project with them. They weren't having king tide issues so much, but really stormwater. And I'm going to really tell this little story. And this is really a lot of what climate adaptation is about. So this is one little stormwater drainage basin. This is the old historic city of St. Mary's. You come in here on Osborne. The ferry to go out to Cumberland Island was over here. It actually got destroyed by Irma, where he'd launched. I think it got moved over here. Here's a little bar that I like to drink in over here in St. Mary's. Here's a little hotel. And there's a storm drain right here, and it goes out to the St. Mary's River that way. And everyone in this area would complain. It rains real heavy, it floods when it's at high tide. And they've got an 8-foot tide range there. And so I'm not going to go in all the weeds of this, but we did some stormwater modeling. Say, yep, if it rains at high tide, you're in bad shape. If it rains at low tide, it doesn't matter with sea level rise, you're probably going to be fine for the next 50 years. So I did some modeling, and I presented this. I wanted to show you April 2016. Went in front of the city council. I'm like, I'm going to show areas of your city flooding. Is that okay? I talked with the hotel owner. He said, yep, because we do flood. So this is what you'll see. If you get a 25-year rain, it happens, it starts raining at high tide, okay? And so I'm like, you guys need to do something about this. And then you hate to actually get your experiment or your model verified. So this is what happened with Hurricane Matthew. This is the area here. This is the St. Mary's River. And this is what happened with the peak flood of Matthew. Of course, there's a big hurricane. And so, of course they flooded. The USGS, when they were out there doing a lot, they had all sorts of gauges. And my area here, they put a gauge right there at the ferry, and it was about a foot higher than it was anywhere else. Why? Because the stormwater structure was failing. And so because they had this antiquated stormwater, that rainfall was enough to actually, and that 1 foot was a big difference. That was enough to put water in the right there in the bar. And so, I can tell you the bartender was really mad about that. And so what are they doing in St. Mary's? They've actually got a 319 grant through the EPA. They're trying to put in some green infrastructure and trying to hold more of the water back and upgrade their stormwater. All of this ends up being, all this stuff, there's no one-fit solution. Every community has to figure out your own, what's going on within your local context. And they're actually just trying to put up the finishing touches on this. I'll say Matthew and Irma really convinced them they had to do something there. All right, I'm going to talk about Satellite Beach a little bit. Has anyone been to Satellite Beach, a little bit south of Cocoa? And so what we did, we had a big project there with Florida Sea Grant, and we're just wrapping that up. I thought I saw Aaron D80 as well. So Satellite Beach is an really interesting community. They've been planning for sea level rise now for about 10 to 15 years, which in Florida is like really early, and really aggressively as well. And what was interesting about Satellite Beach as well is they've got a pack rat for their public works director. And so he kept all the maps from the 1970s. And so we were able to actually map their infrastructure in a very detailed way. And they've got a stormwater master plan, that stormwater fees, which are very high. Some people complain about that, but when it rains and it doesn't flood, then people are happy that they're paying the fee. But what we did is we went through and mapped and said, okay, even at really high water events right now, a lot of their stormwater infrastructure, there is water, there's actually seawater, it's actually coming over here from the Indian River Lagoon, is just right there within the stormwater, right, within the stormwater system. And so they have constructed elaborate ways of trying to manage this and trying to stave it off, trying not to go to pumps. It's real serious stuff. And of course, sea level rise is not rocket science. That's why I got into it, is the sea rises, that basically the water goes further inland and it floods more areas. If the sea's at 1 foot and you're at 0 feet, you're going to be standing in 1 foot of water, is what I always say. And then with sea level rise up to 2070, basically they're going to have to rethink their stormwater system for sure. What's interesting about Satellite Beach, and I put this in here just in case you think that flood insurance maps are right, because they're not. So within Satellite Beach, the flood insurance area with FEMA says this is in the floodplain and this is in the floodplain. Interestingly, if you looked at flood insurance there, only 625 people would be required to actually have flood insurance. Really smart people in Satellite Beach, NASA engineers and such. About a little over twice as many have actually bought flood insurance. And then you might ask why. You know, why would you have flood insurance if you don't have to? So again, they don't account for stormwater drainage. And I'm going to kind of skip through this a little bit. And so this was very interesting. Okay, in Satellite Beach, again, here is the flood insurance rate map. I did some modeling using another FEMA tool to come up with the 100-year flood mapping, which is called HAZUS. And I want you to look at this. This is what we came up with a 100-year flood map using HAZUS. Again, another FEMA tool, and we were very concerned. Wow, did we do something wrong? This is really different. We talked with the FEMA flood mapping people. The best explanation we got was that flood insurance maps are for property. HAZUS is for human life, and so there ends up being a distinction between these. Ends up being a big, big difference. And I give a lot of credit to the city of Satellite Beach. They say, we're going to make decisions based upon this. The fire station in Satellite Beach is one of my favorite stories, okay? This is actually a canal that's right along the Indian River Lagoon. Here's the fire station. And so the city was in the process of saying, you know, this fire station is about 50 years old. It's time to upgrade it or maybe move it. And then why would you want to move it? Well, they said, well, we've noticed when it rains real heavily, this road out front sometimes floods now. And so they're like, can you do some kind of site assessment? So I went in. It turns out the road's very, very low. This is low lying over here. But nothing's in a flood zone. I want to say that too. And actually the fire chief was like, we're not in a flood zone. It's going to be all right, at least when I was there doing the mapping. And then I went out and said, okay, the HAZUS said you would have 4 feet of water in your fire station, right, at a 100-year flood with HAZUS. And he's like, that would never happen. What would cause that to happen? And I'm like, you know, maybe a storm sitting over you and dropping 30 inches of rain. I don't know. HAZUS doesn't tell us, but I'm just saying this is what it is. And this is one of these things you can't make up again. So this was in about July of 2017 or so. And then when I was presenting this to the city council, this is what the projection was for Irma. They were evacuating the city, and then Irma was supposed to hit the city as a Category 5 storm with this map. And so let me just say that the city council was receptive to the message we had. And then the fire chief as well had just returned from Hurricane Harvey. He had responded. So he'd been, and then he came up to me. I will never forget the fire chief coming up to me and saying, I know what would cause this to flood now. I'm not going to fight you. He's like, we need to move the fire station. Because he'd seen this with Harvey. And so we don't know what kind of storm, if that's going to hit Satellite Beach. We don't know, of course, but it could. So yeah, they actually moved it to higher ground, which is a great story. I think it's actually the proudest moment that I've had in my career, that, okay, we're moving this somewhere else where it's not, it's to be higher and drier. All right, I'm going to end with the Keys here. And I saw Aaron back there somewhere. Monroe County and the Keys, I think they call it the Conch Republic for good reason. It's a very interesting place. So we went out and we did some stormwater inventory. And the Keys, if there's a place within the United States, within Florida, that's vulnerable to sea level rise, it's the Florida Keys. It's very interesting. I went out and mapped a bunch of stormwater for the county, and I was out there on one of the hottest days they've ever had, actually, in Key West. And I was out there in some mangroves, and someone said, they saw me coming out, and they're like, "Are you here to relocate the crocodiles?" No. Crocodiles? Where are these crocodiles you speak of? They were small, it turns out. But and so we went out, and we mapped a whole bunch of stormwater. We actually updated their stormwater plan. Last time it had been mapped was about 15 years ago, and we found about twice as many storm drains, various other things out there. And what we found out in the Keys is it turns out they're very vulnerable. And after about 2 feet of sea level rise, most of the stormwater infrastructure in the Keys will cease to really function. And exactly what to do about that, we're in the process of, what are some kind of recommendations to do within the Florida Keys. And it's, there's no one size fits all, is all I can really say. Okay, just a few parting thoughts here. And there's a huge need for this, for mapping stormwater. I would hazard to say, even on this community, there's probably a need to map your stormwater infrastructure and see how vulnerable it is to sea level rise. It's great for students. I'm already training my son, who's 8, in STEM-based education, and I'm a real proponent of that. Really high visibility. People are curious when you're out there mapping, and it's not that hard to do. I shouldn't say that. It's the hardest thing. You should pay me a lot of money to do it. It's not that hard. People can do it. GPS technology is really improved. Useful. Communities can use this immediately. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the really complicated models anymore. I really, we need to get data to understand what to do. And I really think that the flood insurance policies and also water quality are going to really force the hand. There has been this idea in Florida, unfortunately, that if we don't know our stormwater is good, because then we don't have to do anything about it. That attitude is probably going to go away, I would think. And so I'd say just get in front of it now while you can. Work with your local universities and that sort of thing. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop. Is there any time for questions? Or?
There will be time for questions, but Erin's getting a little help getting her
Great.
loaded. So
There's Erin.
So while you can either, while they're loading her
Sure.
drive, you can either answer questions from there or down front.
Great. All right. Yes, if anyone has any questions, I'll even go over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions? I know I threw a lot at you.
How long does it typically take to analyze a stormwater system of a small municipality like that?
It depends upon if you've actually got the data. So if you have already had it surveyed in, and do we understand all of, let's say the elevations, the invert elevations we call them, it's actually not that hard to do. If you have to go out and actually find all of your stormwater system, you need to map it, you need to survey it in. That's a little bit more complicated, and that can take longer. But it's yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, cool. So yeah, so it just really depends upon just exactly where you're at. So it's hard to say, and so. What's the population here for this island?
About 5,000.
Okay, about 5,000. What's the area? Do you know the land area?
9.
It's about 9 square miles. Okay. About that's actually not that hard to do. I mean, and it would probably take about a year to really get in there and map it and to really wrap your hands around it.
And then what are some of the potential solutions if your stormwater pipes are, say, too low?
So the easiest ones I call kind of duct tape adaptation is things like the flap gates that you can put on the pipes, the duct bills, and so those are relatively cheap. And so what they basically do is they're one-way valves, and so they allow the water to come out, but they don't allow water to come in. And those are relatively cheap. They do have to be maintained. things like sticks can get into them. It's not like you put them on and then it's just done. You still have to keep them really functioning. Then from there, you get into things like trying to reduce the amount of impervious, right? So if there's less water that's going into the pipes, then that helps. You want to hold more of your water up. And then as you kind of go down the list, it gets more expensive. So things like pumps, so you get into pumps. And I don't like to recommend pumps because they're expensive, they're complicated, they can fail, you have to maintain them. But there are some communities where that's really the only feasible thing to do. For example, like Miami Beach, they've invested how much on pumps? I mean, hundreds of millions.
650 million.
Yeah, so they're investing in pumps to a really substantial amount, and so there are certain areas where yeah, basically if you want to keep the water out and then your stormwater system is low, you're going to have to use pumps. Yeah, question in the back?
Yeah, regarding sea level rise, I had heard sort of a rule of thumb about to help project the impact even of a minor amount of sea level rise, which was something to the effect of, 1 foot what meant a quarter mile further inland. I see there's great variability
Yeah.
in the predictions and also in the averages by area.
Yep.
But are you familiar with that? And it seemed to, alert people that just a few inches wasn't a good thing.
Sure. Yeah, for this area here, Southwest Florida, that sounds about right to where we don't have like big cliffs or anything of that sort down here. So I'd say 1 foot, about a quarter mile. I've heard that rule of thumb, and that's probably pretty accurate for this
And
area.
it's exacerbated by storms. Right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And then in terms of, for example, like tidal influence and how far up the salt water goes, like some of the modeling that was shown a little bit earlier, that where you have a tide range here, is what, about 3 feet, and then so you have another foot of sea level rise up on top of that, and then if you don't have a lot of fresh water that's holding it back, then that seawater can push really far inland, and that's the other thing, and that's where. When we think about water issues in Southwest Florida, again, I lived here about 20 years ago. I lived in Sarasota. This is a relatively water-poor area in a lot of ways, especially in big droughts. And so if you have a big drought and then about a foot of sea level rise, that is going to push the water far inland, I would think. And so, yeah, so there's a lot going on down here that's, that makes it exceptionally troubling, even with just a little bit. Like a few inches of sea level rise that can really change habitats. All right, no more questions. I think they've got Aaron loaded up here, is that right? All right, Aaron, I'm